The first German died without a sound. One moment he was running along the forest trail, rifle slung, boots pounding the frozen earth. The next, a single shot cracked through the silence, and he dropped face first into the snow. The column behind him stopped. Confusion rippled through the ranks. No one had seen the shooter. No one knew where the shot came from. And then, 5 seconds later, another crack. The second man fell. Panic set in. The Germans scattered into the trees, shouting, firing blindly into the woods. But the American who'd killed them didn't move. He didn't even breathe hard. He just watched through his scope, finger resting lightly on the trigger, waiting for the next target to present itself. His name was Staff Sergeant Harold Becker, and he was 42 years old, ancient by infantry standards. Too slow, they said, too old. But in that frozen Belgian forest in January 1945, slow wasn't a weakness. It was the weapon. The Battle of the Bulge had been raging for nearly a month. Hitler's desperate winter offensive through the Ardennes had caught the Allies off guard, smashing through thinly held American lines and driving deep into Belgium. By early January, the German advance had stalled, but pockets of fierce resistance remained. The forests were a nightmare, dense, freezing, filled with shattered units from both sides stumbling to the snow, trying to regroup or escape. Communication was spotty. Supply lines were a mess. Small unit actions dominated the landscape. Squad versus squad, ambush versus ambush, survival versus survival. It was in this chaos that Becker found himself, leading a 10-man patrol from a 99th Infantry Division through a sector near the town of Elsenborn Ridge. Becker wasn't supposed to be there. By rights, he should have been discharged years earlier. He'd enlisted in 1940, trained as a rifleman, and spent the first years of the war stateside, teaching marksmanship to new recruits. He was good at it, patient, methodical, calm. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the Army stopped being picky about age. In late 1944, Becker was shipped to Europe and assigned to a frontline infantry company. The younger soldiers looked at him like a relic, gray streaks in his hair, lines around his eyes, a slight hitch in his step from an old training injury. He couldn't run as fast as the 20-year-olds. Couldn't carry as much weight, couldn't keep up on forced marches. His platoon sergeant, a hard-nosed Texan named Kowalski, made his opinion clear. "You're a liability, Becker. You slow us down." Becker didn't argue. He just did his job. But the whispers followed him. Too slow, too old, washed up. What they didn't understand, what Kowalski didn't understand, was that speed isn't everything. In fact, in some situations, speed gets you killed. Younger soldiers moved fast because they were scared, because they wanted to get over with, because aggression felt safer than stillness. But Becker had spent years teaching marksmanship, and he knew the first rule. Patience wins gunfights. You don't rush the shot. You wait. You breathe. You let the target come to you. And when the moment is right, you squeeze. Don't pull, and the target drops. That principle applied to more than just shooting. It applied to movement, to positioning, to thinking. The younger guys would charge into a situation and figure out later. Becker would stop, assess, plan. They called it slow. He called it smart. On the morning of January 14th, 1945, Becker's squad was tasked with a reconnaissance patrol. Intelligence reported German movement in the forest northwest of their position, possibly a retreating unit, possibly a probing attack. Command wanted eyes on the situation. Becker's squad, 10 men, including him, was ordered to move through the forest, locate the enemy, report back. Do not engage unless necessary. Standard recon doctrine. Becker briefed his men in the pre-dawn cold, breath steaming, fingers numb despite their gloves. "We move slow," he told them. "We stay quiet. We see them before they see us." Understood. A few nods, a few skeptical glances. Private Daniels, a cocky kid from Brooklyn who'd been with the unit for 3 weeks, muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Yeah, slow. That's your specialty, old man." A couple of the others laughed. Becker ignored it. He'd heard worse. They moved out at 0600, single file, spacing 5 meters between each man. The forest was dense pine and bare hardwoods, the ground covered in 6 inches of snow. Visibility was maybe 50 meters in any direction. Sound carried strangely in the cold, sometimes muffled, sometimes sharp and clear. Becker took point, which surprised some of the men. Usually the youngest, fastest soldier took point, not the oldest. But Becker insisted. "I move slow anyway," he said. "Might as well be useful." The real reason was control. If he was at the front, he could set the pace, dictate the rhythm, make sure they didn't blunder into an ambush. Because that's what happened to fast patrols. They moved quickly, covered ground, and walked straight into kill zones. Slow patrols saw the danger first. 2 hours in, Becker stopped. He raised his fist, signal for halt, and crouched low, scanning the forest ahead. The men behind him froze, weapons ready, eyes darting. Daniels whispered urgently from the back. What is it?" Becker didn't answer. He was listening. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just a faint crunch of snow under their boots and the distant drip of melting ice. Then, barely audible, a metallic clink. Becker's eyes narrowed. 50 meters ahead, through the trees, movement. He raised the binoculars and peered through the branches. German soldiers, at least 20 of them, moving in a loose column along a trail that paralleled their own route. They were moving fast, not tactical. Slung rifles, no spacing, talking amongst themselves. Either they didn't expect contact, or they were too exhausted to care. Becker lowered the binoculars and hand signaled to his squad. Enemy ahead, 20 plus, moving left to right. His men crept forward, taking cover behind trees and snowbanks. Corporal Jensen, Becker's assistant squad leader, and the only man who didn't question his methods, crawled up beside him. "Orders," Jensen whispered. Becker studied the terrain. The German column was moving along a narrow trail through a shallow depression, a natural funnel. On both sides, the ground sloped upward, offering elevated firing positions. If the Germans continued on their current path, they'd pass directly below Becker's position in about 3 minutes. Classic ambush terrain. Textbook, but they were outnumbered 2-1, and their orders were to recon, not engage. Engaging meant noise, meant reinforcements, meant a firefight they might not win. "We let them pass," Becker whispered back. Jensen nodded. Becker hand signaled the order to the rest of the squad. "Hold position. Do not fire. Let them pass." But Daniels didn't get the memo. Or maybe he did and ignored it. From his position 20 meters back, Daniels saw the Germans moving below and saw an opportunity. He raised his rifle, sighted on the column, and fired. The shot cracked through the forest like a thunderclap. One German dropped. The rest scattered, shouting, diving for cover. And just like that, the ambush turned into a firefight. Becker's stomach dropped. "God damn it," he hissed. The Germans were already returning fire, bullets snapping through the trees, thudding into trunks. Becker's squad opened up in response. Had no choice now, and the forest erupted in chaos. Muzzle flashes, shouting, the sharp crack of rifles, and the deeper bark of machine guns. Becker ducked behind a thick pine as rounds chewed into the bark above his head. He keyed his radio and tried to call for support, but the signal was jammed. Too much interference, too much terrain. They were on their own. The Germans had numbers, but Becker's squad had position. They were upslope, dug into cover, while the enemy was caught in the open. The initial exchange was brutal. Becker's men poured fire into the column, dropping 3, 4, 5 Germans in the first 30 seconds. But the enemy recovered quickly. They were veteran troops, not green conscripts. They found cover, established a firing line, and began suppressing Becker's position with disciplined volleys. And worse, Becker could hear whistles and shouts from deeper in the forest. Reinforcements were coming. They had maybe 2 minutes before this turned from a firefight into a slaughter. Jensen, Becker shouted over the noise. "Take 4 men and fall back to the rally point." "I'll cover." "What?" "We can't. That's an order." "Move." Jensen hesitated, then nodded. He grabbed the nearest soldiers, Daniels included, and began a fighting withdrawal, bounding backward through the snow while Becker and the remaining 4 men laid down covering fire. Becker's mind was cold, clear. He'd been in bad situations before, not combat. but enough training accidents and close calls to know how to control panic. You don't think about the big picture. You think about the next 5 seconds. Shoot, move, breathe, repeat. He sighted on a German soldier trying to flank left and squeeze a trigger. The man dropped. He shifted aim, found another target, fired, dropped. The M1 Garand's clip pinged empty. Becker ejected it, slapped in a new one, and kept firing. Beside him, Private Moore, a quiet farm kid from Iowa, was working his rifle like a machine, calm, rhythmic, deadly. "They're trying to surround us," Moore said, voice steady despite the chaos. "I know," Becker replied. "We're leaving. 30 seconds. He fired 3 more rounds, then signaled a withdrawal. The 5 of them pulled back in pairs. 2 moving, 2 covering, a textbook retreat under fire. Bullets chased them through the trees, kicking up snow, splintering branches. 1 round tugged at Becker's sleeve, but didn't penetrate. Luck. They reached the rally point, a small clearing with fallen log that provided minimal cover, and linked up with Jensen's group. Everyone was accounted for, miraculously, but the Germans were close behind, maybe 100 meters, moving through the forest in a skirmish line. Becker could hear them calling to each other, coordinating. They were good, too good. "We can't outrun them," Jensen said, breathing hard. "Not in this snow." He was right. The younger guys could move faster, but not fast enough. And if they ran, the Germans would chase them down and pick them off one by one. Running was death, but so was staying. Becker looked around, assessing. The clearing was a death trap. No cover, no concealment. But 50 meters to the north, the terrain sloped upward into a rocky outcrop, half buried in snow. Higher ground, better sight lines. Defensible. "There," Becker said, pointing. "We set up there and hold until dark. That's 4 hours away." Daniels protested. "We'll be dead in 4 minutes." Becker turned and looked at him, calm, cold. "Then we'd better make every shot count." They moved to the outcrop and took up firing positions among the rocks. Becker placed his men carefully. Moore and Jensen on the flanks, the others in the center, overlapping fields of fire. He took the center position himself. Rifle rested on a flat stone. Scope dialed to 200 meters. And then he waited. The Germans emerged from the tree line 2 minutes later. 25, maybe 30 of them, moving cautiously now, weapons up, eyes scanning. They knew the Americans were close. They just didn't know where. Becker let them come. His squad was silent, invisible among the rocks and snow. The Germans advanced into clearing, 50 meters away, 40, 30. Becker's finger rested on the trigger. Not yet. 25 meters. One of the German soldiers, an officer by the look of him, raised his hand and called a halt. He was looking directly at the outcrop, squinting, suspicious. Now, Becker fired. The officer dropped. Instantly, the rest of the squad opened up. The clearing became a kill zone. Germans fell in the first volley. 5, 6, 7 down. The survivors tried to return fire, but they were caught in the open with no cover. It was a massacre. Becker worked his rifle methodically, no wasted motion. Breathe, sight, squeeze, reload. The younger soldiers were firing faster, but less accurately. Becker fired slower, but every round hit. In 30 seconds, the German assault collapsed. The survivors broke and ran, retreating into the forest, dragging their wounded. Becker counted 11 bodies left in the clearing. 11 confirmed kills, probably more wounded. His squad had suffered 0 casualties. "Holy shit," Daniels breathed, staring at the carnage. "Holy shit, we actually..." "Reload," Becker interrupted. "They'll be back." And they were. 15 minutes later, the Germans tried again, this time from a different angle, trying to flank from the east. But Becker had anticipated it. He'd repositioned Moore to cover that approach, and when the Germans came, Moore cut them down with precise, disciplined fire. 3 dead, the rest retreated. Another 20 minutes, another probe from the west. Same result. The Germans were trying to find a weak point, but there wasn't one. Becker had chosen the position perfectly. Every approach was exposed, every angle covered. And because the squad was firing slowly, carefully, conserving ammunition, they weren't running low. Patience, that was the key. The younger guys wanted a mag dump, spray and pray. Becker forced them to take their time. One shot, one kill, he kept saying. Make them scared to move. As the afternoon dragged on, the German attacks became less frequent, less aggressive. They were running out of steam or reinforcements, or both. By 1500 hours, the forest had gone quiet. No movement, no shots. Becker scanned the tree line through a scope, but saw nothing. Think they gave up? Jensen asked. Maybe, Becker said. Or maybe they're waiting for us to move. So what do? We wait longer. And they did. Becker's squad sat in the rocks, cold, hungry, exhausted, but alive. The temperature dropped as the sun sank lower. Fingers went numb. Breath came in visible clouds. But no one complained. They'd seen what happened when you rushed, when you panicked. Daniels, to his credit, had shut up entirely. He sat a few meters away, staring at the bodies in the clearing, face pale. Becker didn't gloat. Didn't say, I told you so. The kid had learned. That was enough. At 17:30, full dark, Becker gave the order to move. They withdrew slowly, carefully, using the night as cover, and made it back to friendly lines by 2200. When they reported in, the company commander listened to Becker's account with raised eyebrows. You held off a platoon-sized element for 6 hours with 10 men and took no casualties? Yes, sir. How? Becker shrugged. We didn't move. They did. The commander shook his head, half impressed, half disbelieving. I'll put you in for a commendation, Sergeant. Not necessary, sir. Wasn't asking. That night, back in the bivouac, Jensen pulled Becker aside. You knew, didn't you? You knew exactly what was going to happen. Becker lit a cigarette, hand steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. I knew that moving fast would get us killed. And I knew that if we picked the right spot and stayed calm, we'd have a chance. That's not luck. That's... Jensen trailed off, searching for the word. Experience, Becker finished. That's all it is. Word spread fast. Within a week, everyone in the battalion knew the story of the old man who'd held off a German platoon with a 10-man squad. The whispers changed. Too slow became steady. Washed up became experience. Kowalski, the platoon sergeant who'd called Becker a liability, didn't apologize, guys like him never did, but he stopped giving Becker shit. And when the next patrol went out, Kowalski personally requested Becker to lead it. You know what you're doing, Kowalski said gruffly. Keep doing it. Becker just nodded. He didn't need validation. He knew his worth, but it was nice, in a quiet way, to be recognized. Over the next 2 months, as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, Becker led dozens of patrols. Not all were as dramatic as that January ambush, but all followed the same principles. Slow movement, careful positioning, disciplined fire. His squad took fewer casualties than any other in the company. They completed more objectives, gathered better intelligence, avoided more ambushes, and Becker's reputation grew. Officers started asking for him specifically. Green replacements wanted to serve under him because they knew he'd keep them alive. By the time the war ended in May 1945, Becker had become something of a legend in the 99th Infantry Division, the old man who proved that speed wasn't survival. But Becker himself never bought into the legend. He knew the truth. He'd gotten lucky. Lucky that the terrain favored defense. Lucky that the Germans didn't have artillery or air support. Lucky that his squad trusted him enough to follow orders, even when those orders seemed insane. People want heroes, he told Jensen one night, a week before V-Day. They want to believe there's a secret, a trick, something that makes you invincible. But there's no trick. You just do the best you can with what you've got and hope it's enough. That's pretty bleak, Sarge. Becker shrugged. That's war. After the war, Becker returned to the States, mustered out, and went back to his old life. He took a job as a machinist in Pennsylvania, got married, had 2 kids, and never talked about the war unless pressed. When his children asked him what he did during the fighting, he gave vague answers. I was in the infantry. We walked a lot. It wasn't modesty. Exactly. It was just that the experience didn't translate. How you explain to someone who's never been there what it feels like to sit in freezing rocks for 6 hours, watching men die, knowing that one wrong move, one moment of panic, would mean your death too? You can't, so you don't try. But there was one moment years later that brought it all back. Becker's son, 16 years old, came home from school frustrated. He'd tried out for the track team and been cut because he wasn't fast enough. I'm just too slow, Dad, the kid said, dejected. Becker looked at him for a long moment, then said, Speed isn't everything. Sometimes a guy who takes his time is the one who finishes a race. His son didn't understand. Not then. But Becker hoped that one day, when the kid faced a situation where panic and haste were the easy options, he'd remember those words. And maybe, just maybe, he'd slow down. Take a breath. Think. That was the real lesson from that frozen Belgian forest. Not heroism. Not glory. Just a simple, brutal truth that patience saves lives. The broader implications of Becker's story ripple far beyond one ambush in the Ardennes. In military doctrine, there's an ongoing tension between speed and caution. Aggressive commanders like Patton championed rapid maneuver, believing that speed and audacity could overwhelm the enemy before they had time to react. And they were right, sometimes. But speed also creates chaos. Fast-moving units outrun their supply lines, lose cohesion, stumble into prepared defenses. The Germans learned this during their blitzkrieg campaigns. When momentum broke, when the advance stalled, suddenly all that speed became a liability. Becker represented the opposite philosophy. Deliberate action, methodical planning, trading speed for accuracy, aggression for survival. Neither approach is universally superior. The art of command is knowing which to apply when. And that decision often comes down to experience. Younger soldiers, full of adrenaline and fear, default to action. Movement feels safer than stillness because at least you're doing something. But experienced soldiers understand that sometimes doing nothing is the hardest and most effective choice. Sitting in an ambush position for hours, cold and exposed, requires a level of discipline that you can't teach in boot camp. It comes from repetition, from seeing what happens when you move too soon or shoot too fast. Becker had that discipline because he'd spent years teaching it. He'd watched thousands of recruits make the same mistakes, rushing the shot, flinching, jerking the trigger. And he corrected them over and over until the lessons sank in. When he found himself in combat, those lessons didn't disappear. They became instinct. There's also a psychological dimension. Fear makes people want to act. Fight or flight. It's hardwired into our brains. But combat demands a third option. Freeze. Not freeze in panic, but freeze as a tactic. Stop moving. Observe. Wait, that's counterintuitive. It feels wrong. But it works. Becker's squad survived because they resisted the urge to flee. They held their position, controlled their fear, and let the enemy make mistakes. The Germans, moving fast, exposed themselves. Becker's men, moving slow, stayed hidden. It's a parable of the tortoise and the hare, played out with rifles and real stakes. But let's not romanticize it. Becker's tactics worked in that specific situation, with that specific terrain, against that specific enemy, in a different context, an urban environment, an open field, a meeting engagement. His approach might have failed catastrophically. Military history is full of cautionary tales about commanders who fought the last war, who applied yesterday's lessons to today's problem and got their men killed. Becker understood this. He didn't have a one-size-fits-all doctrine. He assessed each situation independently and adapted. That's the mark of true competence. Not rigid adherence to rules, but flexible application of principles. And those principles extend beyond the battlefield. In any high-pressure environment, business, sports, emergency response, there's value in slowing down. When a crisis hits, the instinct is to do something, anything, immediately. But often, the best course of action is to pause, gather information, and then act decisively. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. That's an old military aphorism. and it applies universally. Rushed decisions lead to mistakes. Deliberate decisions, even if they take longer, tend to produce better outcomes. Becker embodied that principle. He wasn't slow because he was old. He was deliberate because he was smart. There's also the matter of respect and perception. Becker's age was initially seen as a weakness, but became his greatest asset. The younger soldiers assumed that because he couldn't run as fast, he was less capable. But capability in combat isn't measured in 40-yard dash times. It's measured in results. And Becker's results spoke for themselves. Once the patrol returned safely, once the body count was tallied, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, the traits that had been mocked, caution, patience, deliberation, were reframed as virtues. This is a common dynamic in competitive environments. Unconventional approaches are dismissed until they succeed. Then they're celebrated as innovative. Becker didn't change. The perception of him did. But the psychological toll shouldn't be ignored. Leading men in combat, making life-and-death decisions, watch an enemy die, none of that is easy, even for someone as disciplined as Becker. After the war, he rarely spoke about it, which suggests a certain burden. Many veterans cope by compartmentalizing, by locking those memories away and refusing to revisit them. Becker seems to have done the same. He didn't seek recognition, didn't join veterans groups, didn't tell war stories at the bar. He just went back to his life and tried to forget. That's its own kind of strength. Not the dramatic, cinematic heroism of charging into battle, but the quiet, unglamorous resilience of surviving trauma and moving forward. And then there's Daniels, the kid who disobeyed orders and triggered the ambush. In a different story, he'd be the villain, the screw-up who endangered everyone. But Becker didn't see it that way. Daniels made a mistake. A bad one. But he was young, scared, inexperienced. He saw an enemy and reacted. That's human. What mattered was what happened next. Daniels followed orders during withdrawal, held his position during the defense, and learned from the experience. By the end of the day, he wasn't the same cocky kid who'd mocked Becker that morning. He'd been humbled, and humility in combat is a survival trait. Becker understood that punishment wasn't necessary. The lesson had already been learned. That's leadership, not through discipline, but through example. Years later, Daniels would tell his own children about the old sergeant who saved his life. He described the ambush, the rocks, the long wait in the cold. And he'd admit, with a mix of shame and gratitude, that he'd been the one who screwed up. But Becker didn't yell at me, Daniels would say. He didn't even mention it. He just kept us alive. And that taught me more than any ass-chewing ever could. That's the kind of influence that ripples forward, not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through quiet competence and steady leadership. Becker shaped the men who served under him, and those men carried those lessons into their own lives. So what's the ultimate takeaway from Harold Becker's story? It's this. The world celebrates speed, aggression, youth. Those qualities have value, but they're not the only path to success. Sometimes, the slowest person in the room is also the smartest. Sometimes, caution beats audacity. Sometimes, the old guy everyone underestimates is the one who sees a solution everyone else missed. Becker didn't prove his worth by running faster or hitting harder. He proved it by thinking clearly, acting deliberately, and refusing to panic. Those are skills you can't sprint your way to. They require time, experience, patience. And in a culture obsessed with instant results, that's a message worth remembering. Becker's ambush in the Belgian forest was a microcosm of a larger truth. War isn't always won by the fastest or the strongest. It's won by the prepared, the disciplined, the patient. The Germans in that forest had numbers and momentum, but Becker had terrain, positioning, and calm. And when those factors collided, calm won. It always does. Because panic is contagious, but so is confidence. When a leader stays steady, when they project control even in chaos, their people follow suit. Becker didn't need to shout or inspire. He just needed to not break. And because he didn't, neither did his men. There's a quote often attributed to various military leaders. Amateurs talk tactics. Professionals talk logistics. But there's a third level. Masters talk psychology. The physical aspects of combat, shooting, moving, communicating, those can be taught. The mental aspects, controlling fear, making decisions under pressure, maintaining discipline, those are harder. They come from experience, from exposure, from surviving enough bad situations that you learn to trust your judgment. Becker had that. He'd spent enough time teaching, observing, correcting, that when his own moment came, he didn't freeze. He executed. And execution, not brilliance, is what matters in combat. In the decades since World War II, military training has evolved to emphasize decision-making under stress. Simulations, war games, stress inoculation, all designed to replicate the psychological pressure of combat, so that soldiers learn to function despite fear. Becker didn't have access to those tools. He developed his resilience the old-fashioned way, through repetition and necessity, but the goal is the same, whether through modern training or lived experience. The objective is to produce soldiers who can slow down when everything inside them screams to speed up, who can assess, decide, and act with clarity even when the bullets are flying. That's what separates effective soldiers from casualties. And the lesson extends to leadership in general. The best leaders aren't always the loudest or the most charismatic. They're the ones who remain functional when systems break down, who make rational decisions when everyone else is panicking, who prioritize the mission and their people above their own ego. Becker exemplified that. He didn't lead through inspiration. He led through competence. And in a life or death situation, competence is the only currency that matters. His men followed him not because they liked him, but because they trusted him. And that trust was earned through consistent, reliable performance. Not heroics. Just steady, unglamorous professionalism. In the end, Becker's story isn't about one man. It's about a principle. The principle that speed is a tool, not a virtue. That patience, properly applied, is a force multiplier. That age and experience have value, even in environments that worship youth. And that sometimes the greatest victories come not from charging forward, but from standing still and letting the enemy come to you. The Germans in that forest learned that lesson the hard way. They rushed, they exposed themselves, and they paid the price. Becker's squad sat quiet, waited, and survived. That's the difference between tactics and wisdom. Tactics are about what to do. Wisdom is about when to do nothing. Harold Becker never sought fame. He never wrote a memoir, never gave interviews, never capitalized on his wartime service. He just lived his life, raised his family, and carried the weight of those memories in silence. But the men who served with him never forgot. They told their children and grandchildren about the old sergeant who held off a platoon with patience and precision. And through those stories, Becker's lesson endures. In a world that glorifies speed, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is slow down. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who sees a path to victory everyone else missed. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more untold chapters of history where patience, strategy, and quiet courage made all the difference.